All right, everybody. I wanted to do a quick video here on one of my favorite sociologists, one of my favorite social theorists, a fellow by the name of W.E.B. Dubois. And yes, it's pronounced Dubois, not Dubois. We know that because he said so, that he pronounced it for us. So anyway, why do I want to do this? Dubois is really, really important social thinker, sociologist, and contributor to American sociology. Now, I could probably do like a 2-hour video on Dubois alone and his contributions. He was a major, major figure in American academics and in American activism. Pretty much all of the civil rights activism that you've seen and studied from history ties back to Dubois's work. Dubois was the first black Harvard PhD in U.S. history. He was a sociologist. He was the founder of the NAACP. He was the founder of the black magazine called The Crisis, which is still around, which is still a thing. He studied in Germany. He's huge. I mean, he's a really, really important figure, especially in American sociology. I mean, a lot of what W.E.B. Du Bois did 100 years ago, or even longer, back, is stuff that we're just now starting to tap into today. I mean, Du Bois was talking about social construction theory before this theory of social constructionism came out. He was talking about interactionism and double consciousness and things like that in ways that that we hadn't seen before. And he was really, really ahead of his time in many, many regards. A very, very brilliant guy. He is also, in my opinion, probably one of the best sociological writers ever, in my mind. He was now one of that kind of goes with being kind of early in the field, but he didn't write in that very kind of stoic academic prose. He wrote in a much more poetic, much more readable way. So he's probably one of the most readable of the sociologists. So if you have a chance of reading Du Bois's work, it's definitely worthwhile, as opposed to a lot of the other sociologists that I've asked you to read. That it was the prose is a little bit dry, so really, really important guy. Very, very powerful thoughts. He is also probably, as far as I know, the first sociologist to really start digging into race and the sociology of race. And in fact, it was probably a long time before we ended up with sociological theorists who were looking specifically at race. So he was approaching this from a conflict perspective, and at that time, the defining characteristic of the conflict perspective was class, right? It was Marx, it was Weber. They were talking about class distinctions, and Du Bois comes along and says, "Whoa, wait a minute. We actually have another variable, especially here in the United States. We have another variable to think about. We need to think in terms of race, right? Racial categories." And one of the things that Du Bois is going to point out is that, in fact, race overlaps with social class in some really, really significant ways that guys like Marx and guys like Weber are not really pointing out. Now, of course, Marx and Weber didn't live in societies that were as racially fragmented as the United States, and that may have given Du Bois a bit of an insight here. So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about Du Bois. Now, Du Bois had a whole bunch of theories and thoughts and concepts that are really, really important. I really want to specify one, and what I refer to as his stages of oppression of marginalized groups, and I think that's really, really important because now Du Bois, of course, was applying this theory to black men specifically, but if you actually take a look at how he's analyzing black men in America during his time, and I guess we could say elaborate to during our time, we can actually see a lot of these stages, a lot of these variables put into place with regard to women, with regard to other LGBT groups and other marginalized groups in society kind of experience much the same thing. So we can use Du Bois from a feminist perspective, even though arguably he didn't. we can still do that. We can look at this in terms of, neurodiversity, ageism, looksism, whatever it is you want to point out. We can actually look at these in terms of stages of oppression. So I wanted to take a closer look at Du Bois' stages of oppression and understand just exactly how that ties in with our understanding of race and inequality in sociology. Okay. Now, the underlying theme of W.E.B. Du Bois' work is the assumption that race itself is a social construct. Now, Du Bois didn't speak in terms of social constructionism. The social construction theory didn't come out until the 1960s. And Du Bois is going to pass away in, I think it was 1963. So his work doesn't actually use the term social constructionism, but we do, and it's probably the easiest way to understand it. In other words, race is not necessarily a natural biological category, right? Race is socially constructed. So yeah, then maybe we could kind of look at some physical differences between black men, black women, white men, white women. We can kind of look at some of those, but those really, in and of themselves, are biologically meaningless for the most part, right? There isn't anything to being black or being white or being Oriental or whatever that infers superiority or inferiority. There is nothing there. In fact, what Du Bois is going to point out through his studies is that many of the things that are holding African Americans back in his time and arguably in our time isn't biological, it isn't natural, it isn't inherited, it is in fact structural. It is the way the society is set up. Right? So race isn't a matter of biology, it is a matter of how the larger society defines people with particular characteristics. And to kind of put this into stark contrast, we have to understand that at the time that Du Bois was writing, we could take a look at Irish immigrants to the United States, especially Irish Catholic immigrants to the United States, and Italian immigrants to the United States who were coming up in that time. And those two groups were not conceived of and perceived as being white. They were referred to as being a different race. And in fact, they were referred to as being an inferior race. Well, what happened, right? Somewhere along the lines. I mean, if you talk to my Italian, parents and my Italian grandparents and great-grandparents, they saw themselves as being white. They didn't see themselves as being something other than white. What happened? And for the most part, the larger society also sees Italians and Irish as being white today. Why? What happened? Did somebody just sprinkle some magic white pixie dust on us and we became white? No. What happened was the constructs changed, right? So how does that happen, right? And that's the question. That is the question. How does this work? So Du Bois is we have to understand that Du Bois is making the assumption that race is a social phenomenon. It is not a biological phenomenon. So why? What's the point? Why do we designate a group of people as being black or as a different race, and especially as an inferior race that is deserving of inferior outcomes, right? And Du Bois is going to look at this in terms of blacks in America as being a marginalized, or in the terms that he would have probably used, is an oppressed group, right? So what exactly does that mean? Now, what it means, of course, is it's not like a military oppression, right? It's not like we came and conquered, although there are some components of that. No. In fact, according to Du Bois, oppression is also a social process. So what are the social processes involved in oppressing a group of people, right? Millions of people. How do we do that? Well, one of the things that we do is we control that particular group's history. We tell the dominant group, in this case for Du Bois, is white Americans, white male Americans, we can go so far as to say that. It's white Americans who are telling the history of America from a white American perspective. And what is the role that African Americans play in that white American history, right? So what we do is we control the history of African Americans, right? And I've seen this. You've probably seen it if you go on social media. You can talk about and you get into any conversation about the history of slavery and things. Um, one of the themes that we hear is that, well, Africans were living in savagery in Africa, and they were brought to America and allowed to have access to civilization. Well, that is a rewrite of history, and it is not an accurate, right, telling of history. We've had some very, very wealthy and very powerful empires in African history. Mali, the Bantu culture was an expansive culture. Ghana, the Ghanaian culture was extremely wealthy. There were some really, really wealthy empires and cultures and civilizations that existed in Africa. So it's not true that the white people, out of some goodness in their heart, took Africans from savagery in Africa and brought them to civilization in European-held colonies. It's just simply not true, right? And we can see that a lot of this rewrite of history and how African Americans have been kind of written out of history, and the African American history has kind of been rewritten, right? Secondly, the dominant group controls how the marginalized or the oppressed group is represented, right? We see this, Dubois talks about this in terms of, his exact quote is how does it feel to be a problem? So Dubois talks about being in the company of white Americans, white academics. Of course, he's a Harvard PhD, and he's usually around relatively sympathetic white people. And one of the things that he notices is how white people talk to him and converse with him, and they of course make things about race. Hey, isn't it terrible about how bad black people are being treated in the South, and things like that. And one of the things that Dubois points out is really what they're asking, what they're talking about. He refers to this as the unasked question. The unasked question is, how does it feel to be a problem? And Dubois, of course, responds that they don't ask that question, and he doesn't answer that question, right? It's the unasked, undealt with questions. Well, that's the representation. How are marginalized groups being represented in the larger society, right? And we can get examples of that, of how historically black people were represented throughout American history in terms of being criminal, in terms of being kind of bucolic, or underclass. We can talk in terms of those representations, of being menstrualized, right? And so that is part of the oppression process. The marginalized group is represented as being innately inferior, all right? And then third is stereotyping, right? And basically the third kind of, encapsulates the first and the second. So what we do is we have this history, we have an understanding of history that is written by white dominant America. We have representations that are being put out by white dominant America, and that leads to stereotypes of what it means to be an African American, right? And we act on those stereotypes. That's what stereotypes are for. A stereotype is basically a prejudgment of an individual based on ascribed characteristics, in this case being black. So what we then have is we have these stages of oppression, right? Control of history, control of representation, stereotypes. And what this then does to African Americans is it creates this idea of a double consciousness, right? Now, what did double consciousness mean? Double consciousness means that if you are a marginalized or oppressed group within a larger dominant society, then it is not good enough for you to have an understanding of yourself based on your own self-awareness, right? If you are a member of the dominant group, you can have an understanding of yourself in terms of your own self-awareness, and the entire society will largely conform to that. So that's good enough for you. But if you are a member of the marginalized group, the oppressed group, then you not only have to have an understanding of yourself through your own particular lens in terms of self-concept, right? How you perceive yourself, but you also better be able to navigate and understand how members of the dominant group perceive you and perceive your actions. You have to be able to look at yourself through the lens of the oppressor. And this is what Du Bois refers to as this double consciousness, and just how destructive this double Now, Du Bois does point out that this double consciousness actually gives what he believes African Americans have kind of a better understanding of things like American society and American culture, because they have to have this understanding, right? It's a matter of survival. Don't forget, in Du Bois's time, if a African American stepped out of line, right, as perceived by the dominant white group, that could be a death sentence. He could be lynched, and he could be killed for that, right? And one of the stories I can say, or one of the kind of anecdotes that I can say is, if you are a black man walking down the street in Jim Crow America, 1900, 1905, 1910, and a white woman is walking towards you, it is probably best off for you to go to the other side of the road, especially if you are in places in the South where the Jim Crow laws were pretty strictly adhered, right? This racial segregation was held. It was better for you to just go to the other side of the road and not make any kind of eye contact at all. Why? Because it wasn't a matter of, if I may interact with this white woman in an inappropriate way. It's, I may be perceived as interacting with this white woman in an inappropriate way, and that will get me killed. So it is not just enough for me to understand myself as who I am. I also have to understand myself in terms of how other people are perceiving my actions. And this is not something that a white man would have to take into consideration, right? This is not something that a white man walking down the street would have to take into consideration. Now, is there a modern analog to this? Yes, there is. So, for instance, a couple of years ago, it was in the public debate about the disproportionate number of black men who die at the hands of police officers. This is a social fact. This does happen, and this was not news to people in the black community. Of course, they already had structures in place, so it was incumbent upon black parents to teach black kids, especially black teenage boys, how to respond when confronted with a police officer. Right? How should they respond? Now, this is a conversation that white parents don't necessarily have with their white young men, right? Just do what the police officer asks. But that's not the approach. So what the black parents will teach their black, especially teenage sons, is how to present themselves in such a way that they are not going to be perceived as threatening to the white police officer, right? That's an example of a double consciousness. Hey, I am a black man. I get pulled over by a police officer. It's not enough for me to just give my license and registration. I have to be intricately aware of how I'm interacting with that police officer. That's this concept of the double consciousness, right? Du Bois, of course, says it's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. Right? This sense of dual consciousness. Right? So now I think this is really important stuff to understand, and we saw this when you guys watched the brown-eyed, blue-eyed experiment. We saw this in action, right? We saw this in action. Now, it is possible for people in the dominant group to experience this double consciousness, right? If you are a white person and you find yourself in a position where you are the minority, you may end up experiencing this double consciousness, although not necessarily in quite the way that Du Bois is speaking, but you might taste on this, a little touch of this, right? But think about in terms of the brown-eyed, blue-eyed experiment, right? What happened with those kids? They were given the collars because of the color of their eyes, and you actually saw real, measurable consequences of that, right? When they did the card stacks, and the kids who were doing the card stacks, they did well yesterday, but today they're like a minute slower on the card stacks. Why? And so she asks the children, why did you do so poorly on the card stacks? And they all said the same thing, right? It's these collars. we're thinking about these collars, and it makes it difficult for us to think about the words, the card stacks, because we're thinking about the collars. Bam! That's the double consciousness, right? I am aware of what I'm supposed to be doing, but I'm also aware of being trapped in this collar or being trapped in my own skin. That's the double consciousness in action right in front of us, right? The double consciousness. So really, really powerful stuff, right? So now how do we use this? How do we use this stuff? And I want to talk a little bit about that, and then we'll move on. Boom, change the board. Okay, so this leads us to another concept that I think is really important when understanding W.E.B. Dubois. Now, Dubois wasn't just a sociologist. He wasn't just a researcher. Dubois was also an activist, right? He was a founding member of the NAACP, and so he was, incorporated into the civil rights movement. And this is an idea that, let's see if you can actually see this. Hold on. There's a light in the way. All right, so there's the term. All right, so the term that we use is Praxis, right? And Praxis comes from Marx, and it's the idea of it's not good enough to just formulate theories. What you actually want to do is you want to be able to act on those theories to make the world a better place. And this is the idea of Praxis. Acting on your theories to change society for the better in some way, shape, or form, right? So if we take the stages of oppression, we should be able to then strategize some ways of creating a process of liberation, and we can actually see some of these factors in play in modern society. I'll give you some examples. So, for instance, if it is a stage of oppression that the marginalized group doesn't have control of its history, that the dominant group is the one that's going to write the history of the marginalized group, well, then the strategy is pretty obvious, right? It is important for the marginalized group to then take control of their history, to rewrite the history, to go back and take another look at the history. And that's not to say to create a false history, right? No. That is to take a look at the history of the marginalized group that has been left out of the dominant story, right? Slavery wasn't just an unfortunate part of American history that Abraham Lincoln ended and we're done with it, right? No, it's an integral part of history, and it wasn't, how it's represented in our dominant culture. With the happy slaves who were they were slaves, but whatever, they had a good life. No, this was a really, really barbarous and horrible genocidal element of American history. So let's write it as that. Let's try to look at it like in those terms, right? So the idea of going back into the city. Now we can kind of see this in the freedom schools that were created in the 1950s and 1960s, where African Americans whose children were just simply not getting an education that incorporated this kind of history, were actually pulling kids out and saying, "Hey, we're going to teach this history. We're going to teach this, give this education." So but we also start to see this in terms of groups demanding greater attention to marginalized stories in history. A Black History Month, right? Making sure that Black history is written into the American history textbooks, that we understand the problems of colonization, of slavery, of Jim Crow apartheid, right, in the United States, of segregation, right, that we understand this element of history, making sure that that's in the textbooks, right? So that's part of the idea of revising and taking control of history. What about representations, right? One of the stages of oppression is the dominant group will control the representations, how the marginalized group is represented to the larger society. Well, we can challenge that. We can say, hey, wait, and we see this again today with calls for more people of color positively represented on television and in movies, right? And taking leading roles, having more Black leading men and Black leading women, Black academics, positive representations of Black people in in movies, right? And we can also see that other marginalized groups are doing the same thing. We want to see more women in leadership roles. We want to see more LGBT people, right? More neurodiverse people, more handicapped people, right? So we're starting to see a lot of this work come into fruition. We do see a lot more diverse representations of people, marginalized groups, otherwise marginalized groups in our movies and our television, which are our dominant representations. Just recently, Land O'Lakes butter was in the news for taking the picture of the Native American woman off of the butter. There's challenges against teams like the Washington Redskins to change their names. To be, because that is a way of controlling and creating representations that are not necessarily valid and not necessarily beneficial to the marginalized group. So we see that. And also, number 3, if you're going to be stereotyped, then we need to challenge those stereotypes. Right? Whenever something comes up where a racial stereotype is presented, you have people who are willing to say, hey, wait a minute, what you're saying is actually a pretty racist thing. There's racist now, maybe, and it's there's a backlash to this. I'm not a racist. I didn't mean to say something racist. Well, yeah, but it is racist, and you need to know that, and you need to take that into consideration. It is racist to refer to welfare queens, right? We're not specifying that the welfare queen is black, but we know she's black. So that is a representation, and it's a false representation. So yes, we are going to make the claim. You are stereotyping here, and you need to be aware of it. The term Indian giver, right? That's a racial connotation, right? That's definitely a racist statement. So yes, when people make that claim and say, hey, wait a minute, what you just said is racist. I may not have meant it in a racist way, but there may be racist connotations associated with that. And instead of, unfortunately, our tendency is to, hey, political correctness, no, wait a minute, take a step back and say, well, wait a minute, maybe this other person has a point, maybe I should be more aware of the terms that I use and the representations that I put out, and how I am constructing a history here. How does that actually end up stereotyping groups, especially if I have absolutely no desire to do that? If that's not my intention, then I should probably be aware that that may be what I'm actually doing. Anyway, bottom line is that there's going to be a backlash to this. So when people get up and say, hey, wait a minute, we've got all of these statues commemorating Confederate officers in towns all over the country, and those are towns where black people live, and they may not like the idea that somebody who was fighting hard and killing people to keep them in slavery is representative of them in the community. So maybe we need to take these statues down and put up statues that are more representative of the entire community. And then there's the accusation, well, you're erasing history. Well, no, I'm not necessarily erasing history. You can still tell the history. It's just, why shouldn't we have a memorial, an homage to somebody who fought for slavery? Maybe we need to question that in our community, right? Maybe people were all upset about taking the, at least some people, I don't know how upset everybody was. I mean, there's other things going on, right? About taking the Indian woman off of the Land O'Lakes margarine butter. And I mean, that seems like a little thing, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's a step in the right direction. Maybe there's other ways of representing butter than through using a representation of a Native American, right? So there's going to be a backlash to these things, and if this is something that is important to you, you have to be ready and able to counter that backlash, to face that backlash, right? And how do you do this in a way that doesn't, that actually gets you what you want, right? Maybe there are less confrontational ways, but maybe there aren't, right? So anyway, these are some of the debate that the thought and the theory of W.E.B. Dubois inspires and should inspire. Discussions of how to deal with these stages of oppression as opposed to processes of liberation. And in terms of, I don't want to say as opposed to, in terms of processes of liberation, how do we liberate? How do we liberate ourselves? How do we liberate How do we help other people liberate themselves? If we are part of the dominant group, then maybe we could have something to say on the subject that says, hey, wait a minute, no, we do need to take a closer look at our history. We do need to take a look at how we're representing groups in our society. We want to create an inclusive society, assuming that that's your goal, right? We don't believe people should be stereotyped. So how do we address these? How do we challenge these? And that oftentimes requires us to take a look at the historical assumptions that we make without questioning them. Our acceptance of representations blindly, our use of stereotypes, even unwittingly, may take a little bit of self-reflection on all of our parts to actually go through this process of liberation. Anyway, that's my 2 cents worth on Du Bois. Like I said, I could talk on this subject for hours on end, right? But I'm not going to. I guess I don't know how long this is, but it's probably a little longer than you wanted it to be, so I'm going to end now. But if you do want to go into, there's a lot of good stuff on Du Bois. And my suggestion really is to just go and read what he wrote. And it's actually, this is one I can actually feel good about. If you actually do decide to read Du Bois, I think you're going to be pleasantly surprised. It's a lot. It's definitely better than Talcott Parsons. I'll give you that much. All right. So anyway, so there it is. If you have any questions, contact me and I'll help you out.